Racial anxiety, what is it? It's the phenomena, the experience that we have of being worried, concerned, or anxious before or during a cross-racial interaction. And it can be experienced by any of us, but differently. If we're a person of color, the fear may be experiencing discrimination, hostile treatment, or even feeling invalidated. For those of us who are white, the worry is likely to be that something we say or something we do will be perceived as racist. And in both cases, we actually experience that anxiety physiologically. It's an interesting, so the picture of the brain on race is one that we've used at Perception to identify both the experience of anxiety, but also to note that implicit bias, which can overlap with racial anxiety, has actually been reduced by those who take a particular prescription drug that blocks the activity of the part of our brain, the amygdala, that triggers fear and strong emotion. So bias and anxiety are actually physiologically experienced and, again, are manifestations of how our brains operate and the way that sort of our cortisol and stress can be linked to race. So how does racial anxiety show up? What often happens when someone experiences racial anxiety during an interracial interaction is they cut the interaction short. The experience of anxiety is so uncomfortable that people don't want to stay in the interaction. Another way that it can show up is, again, this is often the case for those of us who are white, you notice that you feel the anxiety and you want to connect, but the way that you connect is awkward. One example that occurs far too regularly is someone who's white interacts with someone from another group, let's say Latino, and the thing that immediately comes to mind is, I really like Mexican food. The person who you're talking to says, well, that's very interesting. I don't know why your food choices are of my concern, and I'm actually, Ecuadorian. And often the person doesn't actually say that, but they're thinking that. The reference to food is this awkward attempt to show some commonality across group, but again, in a workplace, not a way to connect that actually has any salience and actually just makes things more awkward. Control failures. A common phenomena linked to racial anxiety is misidentifying people from other groups. It can actually be harder for those of us from one group to distinguish between people from other groups, so implicit bias can play a role in, in misidentifying someone's name, but so can racial anxiety. People can look entirely different from each other, but if they're members of the same group, someone who's anxious about getting something wrong often does. And finally, many times people just avoid interracial interactions because they don't want to experience that anxiety. The effect of that on the workplace, of course, can be profound. Do we want to be liked or respected? And what does this have to do with racial anxiety? Well, in the workplace, of course, most of us think it's important to be both respected and liked. And that's, of course, true. Those of us who are white often presume that we're respected. And so when we have an interaction with someone, we're generally working toward being liked because that presumption of respect is already present. And particularly, again, if we're experiencing racial anxiety, we're very anxious to be sure that a person of color we're interacting with likes us and doesn't see us as racist. So our inclination will be to be warm, to be informal, to seek to be likable. The problem with that is, well-intentioned though it obviously is, for the person of color, that presumption of respect is often not something that can be assumed. We saw in the discussion of implicit bias that people of color are often evaluated as not as competent even when their work is just as good. So it's important for a person of color to have that respect accorded to them, and the liking has to come second. And the person, if they're having an interaction and someone's being warm or being informal, that can actually be perceived as disrespect. That has the effect of having the person of color become slightly more serious, again, seeking the recognition of their agency, of their, sort of accomplishments. And if we think about what happens in a job interview, if you have two intentions going awry, the white person can perceive that they weren't liked, and they can think of the person as not someone who'd be a quote-unquote good fit. The person of color can walk out of the interview and feel as though they were disrespected. So understanding the underpinning of interactions can be really important, because then if, again, you're a white supervisor conducting an interview, recognize that it's important to convey respect and then move toward showing warmth or seeking to be liked. But don't skip that step because, again, doing so can appear disrespectful. Racial anxiety can result in perceiving discrimination very differently depending upon what group were part of. So this is a study done of college students, and the college students were shown scenarios that either involved no discrimination. These were hiring scenarios, so the person who was hired was the most qualified of whatever race or ethnicity. Blatant discrimination, so an example would be a white supervisor hiring a white candidate rather than a candidate of color, even though the candidate of color was clearly more qualified, and the white supervisor making a comment such as, you know, this person belonged to too many minority groups, so it's blatantly discriminatory. Or ambiguous discrimination. The example would be a white supervisor hiring someone who appeared slightly less qualified and saying, but the other candidate didn't take an economics class, and the white candidate did take an economics class. Well, economics wasn't actually a criteria for being hired, so it's not clear whether this was discrimination or not. If you look at the graph in front of you, for everyone, when there's no discrimination, obviously there's not a lot of stress, and the measure here is whether people are experiencing stress or cognitive interference specifically. And no discrimination, very little stress. For those of us who are white, seeing a scenario involving blatant discrimination can trigger a high degree of cognitive interference because the idea of discrimination occurring is surprising. So it's results in rumination and, again, sort of people being surprised and perplexed by an unjust world. Maybe surprisingly to those of us who are white, but sort of an uncomfortable reality. For many people of color, the fact of blatant discrimination is not as surprising. So it doesn't, seeing a scenario involving blatant discrimination may result in an experience of anger, but it doesn't result in cognitive interference because, sadly, it's expected. But the ambiguous discrimination, the sort of orange-yellow color on the far right, for those of us who are white, we often by default explain away ambiguous discrimination. So in reading the scenario where the person was hired who seemed less qualified but was, we were told, had taken economics classes, even though economics wasn't a criteria, we accept the explanation. Well, this person must have been hired because they took an economics class. But for someone of color, the ambiguous discrimination doesn't pass so easily. The question becomes, was it discrimination or wasn't it? Was it really economics, or was the person just trying to find an excuse to hire the person who's white? So the was it discrimination or wasn't it results in cognitive interference. And then there's a second order interference. When there's blatant discrimination, the person of color can be pretty conscious and comfortable that everyone will recognize it as wrong. But when it's ambiguous discrimination, the second question becomes, if I say I think this is discrimination, will I be believed? So thinking about most workplaces, there's not as nearly as many examples of blatant discrimination as there are of ambiguous discrimination. Was one person chosen for a job because of their ethnicity or their gender, or were they chosen because they're most qualified? I don't know. It seems like it might be discrimination. It seems like it might be someone choosing someone from their own group, but I don't know. You know, did someone judge my work differently because of my race or ethnicity? Or were they being appropriately critical? I don't know. So these issues of ambiguous discrimination occur regularly and cause this cognitive interference, which can be, again, in a workplace, very problematic. Racial anxiety, as I mentioned earlier, can show up in our behavior, and this has been studied very intensively in healthcare, because in healthcare, many doctors have come up with sort of excellent protocols to prevent against implicit bias getting in the way of what kind of treatment recommendations to make, but there's still the dynamic part of healthcare where the interaction between healthcare provider and patient matters a great deal. So studies have shown that biased healthcare providers and racially anxious healthcare providers, again, have shorter communications, also speak faster, speak more, and have shorter visits. This results in the patients of color feeling like the care was less patient-centered, was of lower quality, they don't experience the provider as warm and friendly, and they have lower levels of trust and satisfaction. What can happen? What can be done? There are steps that can be taken to reduce racial anxiety, and the first step is, frankly, recognizing that it's something that we can experience. Once we recognize it, that we may experience it, and we find out that recognizing it and continuing to have interactions can allow us to become more comfortable. That can be extremely powerful in and of itself. In a workplace, of course, we want to take extra steps to make sure that people aren't experiencing racial anxiety. What can be done? Creating an experience of institutional belonging, making sure that everyone is seen as part of the group. The National Park Service employees are all National Park Service employees. People who are welcome into the park are all welcome. And also welcome for their whole selves. You don't have to come into the Park Service and change into how people are in the dominant group. You can come in as yourself and people will value that. Priming each of us to think about positive experiences we've had across group can actually be very powerful. For really consequential interactions, let's think of interviews. For interviews, you may not want to go in presuming that you can have as comfortable an interaction with everyone. In fact, you may want to have a carefully devised script so that everyone's being asked the same questions, everyone is having respect accorded to them, and going through a process that allows them then to become comfortable and to show other aspects of their personalities in a way that is, sort of crafted to make sure that the interaction creates a level playing field for all the interviewees, regardless of race or ethnicity. Growth versus fixed mindset, this refers to the idea that if we haven't had such great intergroup experiences to date, we shouldn't presume that that's where we're going to land. We all have the opportunity and the ability to become more comfortable and become more effective in these interactions. And if we trust that we'll become more effective, we're more likely to be. And finally, and to some degree most importantly, if you do say something that inadvertently triggers a reaction in someone else where they feel as though bias may have been present, if you're inadvertently the cause of that ambiguous discrimination, you make a reference to someone in a way that makes them feel like you're stereotyping them as part of a group, and they actually give you the gift of letting you know that you said something that makes them uncomfortable, take that as a gift. You've inadvertently created a harm, apologize, learn from it, and move on. That what can often happen, because it is so uncomfortable to realize that we may have said something that's caused someone discomfort, particularly based upon the experience of bias or race, is we either sort of spend time trying to assure the person of our good intention and we don't listen to what they've experienced, or if our emotion takes over, we may put the other person in the position of feeling like we're expecting them to essentially make us feel better about our mistakes. It's really important that we essentially fail fast, apologize, learn from the experience, and thank the person for being willing to share with us what's transpired. So learn triggers, acknowledge mistakes, and move on. That can allow relationships to remain intact, even if we have said something inadvertently that causes someone discomfort. Anxiety can occur in the context of gender as well. So when we think of gender, we often think of what we call hostile sexism, when someone says something hostile about a particular group. But like ambiguous discrimination in the context of race or ethnicity, what we call benevolent sexism can also get in the way. So in a particular study, there was instructions given to women that were blatantly hostile. Sort of, these men don't really want to work with you, or these men don't think you're up to the task. The women were able to essentially put that in a box of, okay, these are men who hold attitudes that I don't like, but that doesn't affect me. That's not about who I am. Curiously, or sort of again, actually consistently with the ambiguous discrimination, having instructions of, you'll work with men only, but don't worry, it'll be okay, or they'll cooperate with you and help you get used to the job. They know that the new employee could be a woman, and they agreed to give you some time and help. Those comments, which in a sense seem as though they're intended to be helpful, actually in the study that was done in 2007, undermined the women's feeling that they could do the job. So for sort of someone who's a woman, thinking about how we hear different comments and realizing we can sometimes feel worse if it seems like someone pities us or feels sorry for us because of our gender, and we can work against that. And for anyone who's male listening to this, recognizing that respect for people across gender is what we're all looking for. So benevolence or sort of concern linked to gender can actually undermine, even if that's not what your intention was. Linked to sort of the idea of expectations, if we expect people to be enthusiastic about diversity and they're not, it can be more difficult to deal with than if we understand that they have some hesitation or some uncertainty or even some discomfort, because then we know where the person stands and we can sort of organize ourselves to handle that. So a study was done in a college where students were given a description of a peer partner where either the partner described their experiences and views of diversity as being something they look forward to and were excited about, or the person acknowledged that they had some uncertainty and even a little bit of anxiety because they hadn't had much experience with diversity. When the person of color who read the profile encountered someone who expressed enthusiasm about diversity and the person acted cold and offish, that was experienced with far more anxiety by the person of color than when they experienced someone who they expected to be uncertain and that person acted a little awkward or cold. So if we are someone who's conveying ourselves as enthusiastic about diversity, we've got to make sure that we're acting that way, because it can actually be harder if we're putting out ourselves or, in fact, our work environment as one that's open and warm and enthusiastic about diversity, but we haven't actually worked to the point where we can show that or display that to people once they arrive. All of this can create burdens on employees of color or female employees that are obstacles that are quite different and quite a bit more challenging to overcome than our employees who are part of the dominant group. What are the effects? If racial anxiety results in white supervisors or white peers as seeming less engaged, eliciting less information by asking fewer questions, because of avoidance or because of worry not including colleagues of color around significant decisions, that is experienced by the people of color in the office. It can create, as we talked about, cognitive interference. It can be exhausting, to use a scientific term, depleting, to have to navigate the climate where ambiguous discrimination is present, and it can result in people seeking workplaces that are more amenable, that aren't as challenging. All of this results in a workplace lower retention levels, harder to hire people of color, and ultimately the benefits of diversity, the benefits of having many of us from many different groups as part of a particular work climate aren't realized. You don't have the innovation, you don't have the sort of, again, positive creativity and rigor of truly successful diverse workplaces unless both implicit bias and racial anxiety are grappled with so people can be their best selves. Again, the interventions and solutions as I described: belonging, recognition, positive priming, scripts, growth, learning new triggers, acknowledging mistakes. They can do a lot of work.